Our first Geographics video was about a Russian prison, Pyatak, which was made famous by its remote location and by the regime of isolation to which its inmates are sentenced. In today's Geographics video, we're going to explore another prison, which in a way is the radical opposite of Pyatak. This correctional facility is located in one of the most densely populated districts of a great European capital. Its residents are unlikely to complain about being left alone. If anything, overpopulation is more of a problem. So welcome to Santé Prison in Paris. Santé Prison is located in the popular district of Montparnasse, Paris, in the 14th arrondissement. The exact address is 42 Rue de la Santé, and you can easily get there with the metro number 6. The stop is Saint-Jacques. A quick look at the map of the prison's surroundings reveals how tightly it's nestled into the urban and social fabric of the neighborhood. It is surprising to see a prison with a high-security block at walking distance from tourist attractions like the Paris Observatory, Montparnasse Cemetery, or the Catacombs. If you cross the road bordering the southern wall of La Santé, you will stumble upon a nursery, the Jean Delon School. That is the ultimate contrast between the harshness of a correctional facility surrounded by the normality of city life. On a school day, the laughter of children can be heard alongside the rowdy screams of the convicts. Also nearby, you can find a hospital from which the prison took its name. In fact, santé means health in French. This is somewhat ironic, as we'll see later today, as poor healthcare and sanitary conditions are one of the recurring problems in the prison. But when the prison was first founded, it was celebrated as a model institution, a clean and modern correctional facility. La Santé opened for business in 1867, during the reign of Emperor Napoleon III. It was acclaimed as the best and most beautiful prison in Europe by writer and photographer Maxime de Camp. The structure was designed by architect Joseph Auguste Émile Vaudremer, who was famous mainly for his churches, his masterpiece being Saint-Pierre de Montrouge, which is also in Paris. The prison was developed along a perimeter resembling a truncated triangle or a trapeze stretched out along its vertical axis. The broadest side of the trapeze encloses an X-shaped building with a hexagonal structure at its intersection. The arms of the X are the main divisions designed to host up to 1,400 convicts, while the hexagon was the command center for the prison guards. This type of design is Vaudremer's own take on the Panopticon, a prison concept developed by British philosopher Jeremy Bentham. The key idea was to house convicts around a radial structure, with the guards at its center being able to constantly keep them under a watchful eye. One of the divisions, number 3, was designated as high security, although this designation was later extended to a 6th division located in a separate building. Just outside the 3rd division, there stood a small courtyard nicknamed Le Fromage, divided into small triangular wedges. Each wedge is intended as an exercise yard for the convicts, but as you can see from this photo, chronic overcrowding made it almost impossible to move around. Throughout its 152 years, La Santé Prison has served the main function of housing alleged and convicted criminals both before and after their trials. For a long stretch of time, the penitentiary was also the setting for executions by guillotine. Until 1939, the capital punishment was performed in full view of the public in Rue de la Santé, just outside of the prison walls. Since then, authorities preferred to execute death sentences inside the prison. The last death sentence in France was carried out there in 1972. French authorities were not the only ones to make use of the prison and its handy contraption with a falling blade, though. Following the invasion of France in June 1940, German occupation authorities requisitioned La Santé to use as a detention facility for members of the resistance movement. And as a side note about rules of engagement between occupying armies and resistance movements during World War II, in general, regular armies did not recognize partisans and resistance members as regular combatants, and as such, they did not subject them to POW treatment as sanctioned by the Geneva Convention. These irregular fighters were considered instead as bandits, in other words, criminals, meaning they could be targeted by violent reprisals and summary justice. That explains why French partisans were subject to a particularly harsh treatment by the Gestapo and the SS within the walls of La Santé. On the 14th of July 1944, French National Day, and a few weeks after D-Day, the partisans held at La Santé reached boiling point. They stayed staged a large revolt and attempted a mass escape, only to be brutally quashed by the French collaborationist militia. Fortunately, it would take only 5 more weeks before Paris and its prison were liberated by the Allies on the 19th of August. Since the start of the occupation, 28 resistance fighters and political prisoners had been executed at La Santé by firing squad or by guillotine. La Santé has always been a high-profile prison in France, mainly due to its location, but most of all because of the many VIPs, very important prisoners, which have been welcomed as its guests. For the most part, a prison is just a setting. What makes it stand out in history is the cast of characters that animate its walls. In the case of La Santé, these actors included not only your run-of-the-mill career criminal, but also literary and political personalities. So let's begin with the criminal poet. I expect our first VIP was never seen doing pull-ups in the exercise yard nor tattooing his knuckles, but I may be wrong. His name was Guillaume Apollinaire, a celebrated poet, writer, and all-round intellectual. Born in 1880, but dead by 1918, Apollinaire was good friends with Pablo Picasso and was credited as a founder of the Surrealist movement in literature. Literary fame and respect from the intelligentsia did not spare him a shocking accusation, though, and that's art theft. But let's proceed in order. On August the 22nd, 1911, an amateur painter noticed something was missing at the Louvre. That something was the Mona Lisa, arguably the world's most famous painting. Desperate for clues and suspects, Parisian police grilled one Joseph Genet, a well-known art thief. Perret was innocent, but he confessed to stealing 2 small ancient Iberian statues from the Louvre, which he had sold to one of the most famous painters in Europe, Pablo Picasso. Moreover, Perret had been previously employed by Apollinaire as his personal secretary. This sounds like a very flimsy case, but prosecutors thought there was enough of a connection to charge the 2 artists. Other evidence included the fact that both the poet and the painter were living in France at the time, and that Picasso loved art. So, how can you argue with an ironclad case like that? Picasso confessed to buying the stolen statuettes, and he got off the hook very early on, but Apollinaire was held on trial for a longer period. As he awaited his hearing, he spent time at La Santé. Apparently, it was no more than 6 days, after which he was completely cleared of any charge. I expect the experience must have added to his street cred as a nonconformist and innovative poet, at the very least. The poetic criminal. A writer who did not need to boost his bad boy credentials was novelist, poet, and playwright Jean Genet, acclaimed as one of the founders of the theatre of the absurd. Born in Paris in 1910, Genet had a rough life from the get-go. Born illegitimate and abandoned by his mother at an early age, young Jean began a life of crime at the age of 10. In and out of correctional facilities, he spent most of the 1930s traveling across Europe. He was a tramp, a pickpocket, and occasionally a sex worker. In 1952, Genet wrote his first novel, Our Lady of the Flowers, while detained at the Fresnes prison. In 1943, Genet was incarcerated again, this time at La Santé. During this stint, the author wrote Miracle of the Rose. The novel was inspired by his own memories of life in prison, including accounts of sexual relationships with fellow inmates. His novels attracted the attention of French literary heavyweights such as Jean Cocteau or existentialist power couple Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre. Despite critical acclaim, Genet continued to rack up convictions for theft, reaching the 10th one by 1948. According to French law, he could risk life imprisonment if he was convicted for an 11th time, even for just stealing a loaf of bread. In an unprecedented move, Sartre and Beauvoir appealed to the President of the Republic and obtained a unique pardon in advance for Genet. The future president. A president can pardon, but a president can also serve time. A very important prisoner who later became a very important person, or actually the most important person in his country, was Ahmed Ben Bella, the first president of an independent Algeria, who was in power from September 1962 to June 1965. After the end of World War II, the French establishment fought a long, hard, and bitter conflict against the Algerian independence movement. The Algerians were defending their right to self-determination self-determination in the context of widespread decolonialization, while France didn't want to let them go. The North African country had not the status of a standard colony like Morocco or Tunisia, but was considered to be an integral part of France's metropolitan territory. Ahmed Ben Bella was one of the top leaders of the independence movement. His first clandestine group, the Organisation Spéciale, was founded in 1947. By 1949, it had already been crushed, but in 1954, Ben Bella went back to the well with another group, co-founding the National Liberation Front, or FLN, their mission statement being, "The only negotiation is war." The FLN launched a 7-year conflict against French authorities both in Algeria and in France, not shying away from terror attacks on civilians. 2 years into the war, in September of 1956, French security services apprehended Ben Bella on an airplane flying to Tunis. Ahmed Ben Bella spent the next 6 years locked up in La Santé. He was placed in the block known as the 6th Division, reserved for the most dangerous criminals who were subject to high surveillance status. During the first 3 years in there, Ben Bella and other FLN members were in virtual isolation, allowed only a few hours a week in the open air, which he spent playing football by himself in a small courtyard. In a later interview, the independence leader explained how he had to share his block with prisoners who were destined to be guillotined. The intent to intimidate him was clear. "I saw the guillotine from my cell." Eventually, Ben Bella was released in March 1962 after the agreements negotiated at Evian, Switzerland, put an end to the Algerian conflict. The Jackal. Let's take a look at some professional hardened criminals. I haven't checked every single file of every single inmate, but this guy probably racked up one of the longest criminal records among the prison population. I'm talking about international terrorist and hitman Illich Ramirez Sanchez, better known as Carlos or the Jackal. Illich was born on October 12, 1949, from a Venezuelan upper-class family. Influenced by his father's Marxist leanings, Illich enrolled at the Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow, but was expelled in 1970. Desperately seeking a revolutionary cause to serve, Illich joined the Popular Front, or the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP, where he took on the battle name Carlos. From 1973 to 1975, Carlos became one of the most prolific terrorists in Europe. In December 1973, he seriously wounded the president of the department store chain Marks & Spencer. In September 1974, he joined the terror group the Japanese Red Army in the occupation of the French embassy in The Hague, killing 2 bystanders with a hand grenade. In June 1975, after 2 failed rocket attacks against Israeli passenger flights, the Jackal was almost arrested in his Paris apartment, but he shot his way out, killing 2 police officers. A manhunt was launched, but with no results. The Jackal even managed to organize his masterpiece in December of the same year, the kidnapping of 42 officials at an OPEC meeting in Vienna, which he then held ransomed to the Algerian government for tens of millions of dollars. The Palestinians disavowed him, as he was meant to execute 2 of those hostages, not make millions out of the whole affair. Carlos went solo, creating his own terrorist group, but mainly acting as a hitman for different clients, including Muammar Gaddafi or even the Stasi, the East German secret police. His wife and accomplice Magdalena Kopp was arrested in 1982, which triggered him to launch a violent reprisal against the French government with a wave of bombing attacks. As the Cold War thawed, Carlos lost the protection of his friends beyond the Iron Curtain and was eventually forced to remain inactive for the rest of the 1980s and 1990s. Following rumors that Saddam Hussein was looking to recruit the Jackal, French secret services finally located him in Sudan and arrested him in 1994. Since then, Carlos has gone to trial 3 times, 1997, 2011, and 2014. In all 3 cases, he was found guilty of murder and sentenced to a total of 3 life sentences. A prison drama is not complete without stories of daring escape attempts. The first dangerous convict to successfully flee La Santé was Jacques Mesrine, who still enjoys a legendary status among French gangsters and the general public. This was cemented by his own autobiographical books, Instinct of Death and Guilty of Being Innocent, as well as a 2-part biopic starring Vincent Cassel. Born into a middle-class family, Mesrine served as a paratrooper in the Algerian conflict, allegedly killing in cold blood independence fighters after their arrest and interrogation. After his discharge from the army in 1959, Jacques entered a life of crime, initially as a militant within the OAS, the Organisation de l'Armée Secrète, or Organization of the Secret Army. This was a right-wing organization who violently opposed any concessions by the French government to Algerian self-rule. Throughout the 1960s, Mesrine drifted away from the OAS and even tried leading an honest life, but the thrill of action, it was impossible to resist. After committing a string of armed robberies and kidnappings in France and Canada, he was eventually locked up in a high-security prison in Quebec. He escaped in 1972 and terrorized Canadian banks with a local accomplice. The two criminals managed to rob two separate banks within 10 minutes of each other and held up the same bank twice in 3 days. While on the run, Mesrine killed 2 forest guards and wounded 2 policemen when trying to break back into his old prison to free another accomplice. After returning to France, Mesrine continued his robbing spree and finally achieved national celebrity status in March of 1973. Following another arrest, he escaped the courthouse by holding a judge hostage. This is when the press dubbed him Public Enemy Number 1, and the hunt was on. As with any good villain, Mesrine could boast a nemesis, Commissar Robert Broussard, who arrested him in September of 1973. Mesrine spent the next 5 years inside the 6th Division of La Santé, a time in which he took a leaf from Jean Genet's book and wrote his own books, starting with Instinct of Death. He also cultivated his own image, releasing several interviews in which he painted himself as a modern-day Robin Hood, bent on a private war against the banking system. He also took the occasion to criticize the poor conditions of convicts who were held at La Santé. In 1977, Mesrine and accomplice Jacques Dessay dared the impossible, breaking out of La Santé. Their plan was basic but effective. They held 2 prison guards hostage, stole their uniforms, and just managed to walk out undetected. Mesrine's time on the run, it didn't last long though. Commissar Broussard hounded the bandit, and his squad finally closed in on their prey in September of 1977. Mesrine was surrounded by police while driving in Paris. It is debated whether the police were aiming for a quiet arrest or going in for the kill. Whatever their intentions, the consequences were a massive shootout. At the end of it, Jacques Mesrine lay dead. He'd been shot 17 times. In contrast, a prison break with a less violent outcome was Michel Vingeur's escape. Vingeur was one of the most successful bank robbers in France. In 1983, he finally ran out of luck and was arrested for yet another holdup. After a quick trial, he was sentenced to serve 18 years at La Santé. Michel did not languish alone and forgotten in the Parisian prison, though, as he received frequent visits from his wife Nadine. During those first months behind bars, Nadine had picked up a peculiar hobby. Every weekend, she took lessons on how to pilot a helicopter and soon became proficient at flying an Aerospatiale Alouette 2. Had the prison wardens known about this hobby, they might have locked Michel in solitary confinement. On May 26, 1986, the whir of a propeller filled the air above the exercise yard at La Santé. It was, of course, Nadine aboard her helicopter. When the chopper landed on the roof of the prison, Michel made a dash for it and jumped on board. The guards could only gape in amazement at the scene as husband and wife flew free. Public enemy number 1, Jacques Mesrine, had already criticized the poor sanitary conditions of La Santé through his many interviews. In 2000, Dr. Véronique Vasseur, the prison's chief medical officer, published a damning report along the same lines. Her findings raised serious concerns on both the physical and mental health of the inmates. One of the main issues was overcrowding, a problem common to most detention facilities across the world. La Santé had been designed to house a maximum of 1,400 men, but at the time of the report, the prison population numbered 2,300. Unsurprisingly, cramped cells and restricted twice-a-week shower access led to an outbreak of skin infections and other communicable diseases. The generally poor sanitary conditions also fostered rat infestations. Convicts often stuffed their clothes into cracks in the walls to keep the rodents at bay. Another natural consequence of piling up criminals into a restricted space is violence. Physical, psychological, and sexual violence have always been ripe among convicts and guards alike. Prisoners organized in gangs are at an advantage, dominating over those who are isolated or physically weaker. A common destiny among the latter is to become virtual slaves to the stronger convicts. Depression and suicide were also commonplace. 124 inmates committed suicide in 1999 alone, one of the highest rates among European penitentiaries. By comparison, the US state of California has an inmate population of 160,000, and during that same year only saw 24 suicides. And then there is the sexual violence. As we learned from Genet's novels, consensual relationships among inmates were common, but too often sex took a dark turn and rape was widespread. Dr. Vasseur describes the case of a 21-year-old man who was raped by his 2 older cellmates in his first night at La Santé. The young man had contracted AIDS as a result. These cases are a sad reality for many prisons worldwide, but what was disturbing about La Santé was the occurrence of prison guards raping convicts. French prison authorities were slow in taking action to fix La Santé, considering its special status as a prison under the spotlight of the news and popular media. Eventually, in 2014, La Santé closed its gates to allow for a massive refurbishment project intended to fix its long-standing structural issues. If you've ever done any renovation work yourself, you know that these things always go over time and over budget as you deal with contractors who are very skilled at pulling teeth and mumbling, that's going to cost you some extra, isn't it? So, as you can imagine, it took 5 years before the iconic prison reopened for business. La Santé was re-inaugurated. All 800 newly refurbished cells have been equipped with showers, refrigerators, hot plates, and landlines. Half of the cells will be reserved for single occupancy, while the other half will sleep 2 men, for a total of 1,150 to 1,200 convicts. 2 new sections have been opened, a unit dedicated to the most vulnerable prisoners and a new high-security area for Islamist radicals. The security measures have also been improved. For example, the prison now features a frequency jammer intended to disrupt mobile phone communications for convicts. Unfortunately, this has also caused issues for the residents of Montparnasse, whose phone calls have been affected as well. While they may somewhat enjoy the presence of such a historical landmark on their doorstep, neighboring associations have filed a number of complaints for disturbance of the peace. According to a resident of 60 years, in the evening, it's hellish. The conflicts make a fire of God's fire. What is appalling is that there is no curtains and we can see them naked. So I really hope you enjoyed today's video. Before I leave, a couple of questions for you. Would you rather serve time in the overcrowded and violent La Santé or in the frozen hell that is Pyatak? I also barely scratched the surface of many interesting characters today, so if you have one that you'd like to see in a Biographics video in the future, do let us know. That would be great. And as always, hit that like button, please do subscribe, and thank you for watching.